The morning began like any other at Riverside National Bank. Quiet, predictable, almost painfully ordinary. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, printers clicked softly in the background, and the staff moved through their routines with the calm confidence of people who knew exactly how their day would go. But that illusion shattered the moment he walked in. The glass doors parted with a faint hiss, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in all black stepped inside. His presence alone shifted the energy of the entire room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Keyboards paused. Even the security guard straightened instinctively. No one expected Steven Seagal to be standing in their small suburban bank, not in his dark coat, not with that unreadable expression, not carrying a plain white envelope in his hand like it weighed 100 pounds. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked toward the counter with a slow, measured confidence, each step making the bank manager, Sarah Mitchell, increasingly uneasy. She had seen celebrities before, politicians, local stars, wealthy clients, but this was different. Seagal had an intensity that filled the space around him, like the air grew heavier as he approached. "Good morning," Sarah said, forcing a polite smile. "How can I help you today?" Seagal placed the envelope on the counter, tapping it once with his finger. "I need this deposited." Sarah nodded and opened it. Routine, standard, nothing unusual. But the moment she saw the number on the check, her breath snagged in her throat. One check. One signature. One amount. $10 million. She blinked twice, convinced she was reading it wrong. But the ink didn't lie. It was real. And the check was payable to Steven Seagal. Her training kicked in. High-value checks require verification. Policy was policy. And no matter who he was, no matter how famous, a $10 million deposit could not simply be processed. She straightened, her pulse picking up. "Sir, I'm afraid we'll need to verify this," she said carefully. Seagal gave no visible reaction, no frustration, no impatience, just that same calm, unreadable stare. So Sarah did what her protocol demanded. She took the check, looked at it one last time, and tore it clean in half. The bank fell silent. And before Seagal could say a word, her boss stepped out of his office, saw the pieces of the check in her hand, went pale, and whispered shakily, "Sir, what have you done?" For a moment, Sarah Mitchell couldn't tell whether the silence in the bank was coming from the room around her, or from inside her own mind. The torn halves of the $10 million check trembled slightly in her hand. She stared at the jagged edges, her breathing stuck somewhere between her chest and her throat. She had followed protocol. She knew she had. But something deep inside whispered that this time, protocol wasn't enough to protect her. Steven Seagal didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the counter. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, still as stone, watching her with a calm so controlled it was more unsettling than any outburst could have been. Then came the heavy footsteps. Her boss, Harold Peterson, the regional manager known for never leaving his office unless something catastrophic happened, appeared behind her. His face was drained of color, eyes fixed on the ripped check like it was a crime scene. "Sarah," he whispered, barely audible. "Tell me you didn't just tear that." She swallowed hard. I followed policy. A check this large needs verification. The signature." Harold didn't let her finish. His hands moved slowly, almost painfully carefully, as he picked up the torn pieces from the counter. He looked at Seagal, then back at Sarah, then at the pieces again. "Sir," he finally said to Seagal, voice trembling, "please, give us one moment." He grabbed Sarah gently by the arm and guided her into a small side office. The blinds didn't fully close, so she could still see Seagal standing there, unmoving, his posture perfectly composed. Harold shut the door. And then he exploded, quietly but intensely. "Sarah, do you have any idea what you just did?" She tried to stay calm. "Harold, you told me, everyone told me, that for checks over $50,000 we verify before deposit. This is $10 million. I had to follow procedure. Harold exhaled shakily and pressed a hand to his forehead. Yes, we follow procedure. But we do not tear a check belonging to a man like Steven Seagal. Good God, Sarah, this is a federal-level client. Do you understand who he is? Do you understand what $10 million means? She stared at him. So, I'm fired. He paused. His eyes softened. I don't know yet. That depends entirely on what happens next. Sarah felt a cold wave move through her. Her job, her reputation, her future, everything now hung on Steven Seagal's reaction. And the worst part? He hadn't reacted at all. Harold stepped out to speak with Seagal, leaving the office door slightly open. Sarah stayed seated but leaned forward, listening. Mr. Seagal, Harold began cautiously, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. My employee was following standard protocol, although she acted a bit too aggressively. Seagal's eyes didn't shift. His stillness was almost unnerving. What's the verification process? He asked simply. His voice was low, steady, and surprisingly calm. It wasn't anger, it was expectation. Harold explained everything: the call to the issuing bank, identity confirmation, source verification. Seagal listened patiently, hands resting loosely at his sides. And the check? He finally asked. Harold froze. We can tape it back together. As long as the routing and account numbers are intact, the issuing bank should. Seagal cut him off with a small, wave-like gesture. Just get the verification. Then he turned slightly, and his gaze drifted toward the camera, your viewer's camera, as if speaking to them directly. Before we continue the story, comment below, which city and country are you watching from? Back to the moment. Seagal placed the envelope on the counter again. Do what you have to do, he said. I'm not in a rush. He sat down in the waiting area, crossing one leg over the other, completely composed. Harold hurried back into the office where Sarah sat like a statue. Okay, he said softly, shutting the door. Listen carefully. We're not fired yet. But this is delicate. We need to confirm whether his check is real. If it is, then we're going to repair it and pray. Harold, Sarah whispered, what if it turns out the check isn't real? What if I tore a fake? Harold looked at her with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. Then you'll be the luckiest person alive. Because a fake $10 million check from Steven Seagal is a problem I can actually handle. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. 20 minutes passed, each second stretching longer than the last. The other employees watched from the desks, whispering nervously. Finally, Harold hung up the phone from the issuing bank. His face went blank. Not angry, not relieved, just blank. Sarah stood slowly. Well, is it? Harold looked at her. Then he looked at the torn check on the desk. Then he said 5 words that made her knees go weak. The check is completely legitimate. Her breath left her chest. She grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself as the room seemed to tilt for a moment. Harold didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply lowered himself into the seat across from her, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. $10 million. Real. Verified. Legitimate. And she had torn it in half. What do we do now? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Harold slowly lifted his head. His expression was a mixture of defeat and pure, bone-deep fear. Now, he said, we try to fix this in a way that won't destroy the bank. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. Is he angry? Harold shook his head. No. And that's what scares me. Back outside the office, Steven Seagal sat quietly in the waiting area. His posture was straight but relaxed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't tapping his foot, checking his phone, or pacing around. He was just waiting. And that made every employee in the room even more nervous. Sarah stepped out of the office with Harold, the torn halves of the check taped together as neatly as possible. But even with the crisp tape lines, the check looked like a damaged artifact, something no amount of repair could erase. Harold approached Seagal with measured steps. "Sir, the check has been verified," Harold said softly. "It is 100% authentic, exactly as you stated." Seagal nodded once. No reaction. No satisfaction. No frustration. Just calm acknowledgement. Sarah swallowed hard and stepped closer. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mr. Seagal, I sincerely apologize for what I did. I thought I was protecting the bank. I didn't mean to disrespect you." Seagal's eyes lifted slowly, meeting hers directly for the first time. And Sarah felt something she couldn't fully explain. His gaze wasn't angry. It was heavy, knowing, quietly powerful. "You followed your rules," he said gently. "Mistakes happen." Sarah blinked. She hadn't expected kindness. Certainly not from a man she had just humiliated in front of an entire bank. Harold cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, we can deposit the check immediately. It'll process without issues, even with the repair." Seagal leaned back slightly. "I'm not worried about the deposit." Harold and Sarah exchanged a confused glance. He wasn't worried? About $10 million? Sarah hesitated. Then, "What are you worried about?" Seagal didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly stood up, walked toward the counter, and placed the taped check gently on the surface. He tapped it once with his finger. "Do you know why I bring checks like this in person?" he asked quietly. Harold shook his head. "No, sir." Seagal looked around the room, making eye contact with several employees who immediately straightened in their seats. "It's not about the money," he said calmly. "It's about seeing how people treat others, when they think those others have nothing." The entire room seemed to inhale at once. Sarah felt the truth of his words hit her harder than any lecture could have. Harold tried to salvage the moment. "Sir, we assure you, our employees are trained to treat everyone with the same level of respect." Seagal raised a hand, stopping him without hostility, but with an authority that needed no explanation. "You can train people in policy," Seagal said, "but you can't teach instinct. Character shows up in the smallest decisions." Sarah felt a knot in her stomach tighten. He wasn't scolding her. He wasn't humiliating her. He was simply putting truth on the table. And somehow that made it worse. Seagal stepped closer to Sarah. Not intimidating, just close enough that she felt the weight of his presence. "You acted fast," he said. "Too fast. You didn't look at me. You looked at a policy manual in your mind." Sarah nodded slowly. "You're right." He didn't smile. But there was a softness in his voice that surprised her. "You're not the first person to misjudge me," he said. "And you won't be the last." Sarah felt emotion rising in her throat. "Thank you for not yelling. For giving me a chance to fix this." Seagal gave a small nod. Then he glanced at Harold. "So, what happens now?" Harold straightened. "Now we deposit the check. And I'd like to personally offer you a private room, refreshments, anything you need." Seagal tilted his head slightly, amused. "You don't need to do all that." "No, sir," Harold insisted. "We do." For the first time, a faint hint of a smile tugged at Seagal's mouth. Then he looked directly toward the viewers again, almost as if he could see the audience on the other side of the screen. "Before we continue, comment below. Have you ever seen someone make a mistake at work that changed everything? Back in the story." Seagal stepped aside, allowing the staff to prepare the deposit. Sarah took a deep breath. The worst was over, she hoped. But she had no idea that the most shocking part of the day was still ahead. The atmosphere inside the bank had shifted, but not in a way anyone could fully describe. The tension was still there, thick enough to feel, but now it had transformed into something heavier, something more complex. Steven Seagal stood near the counter, arms loosely folded, watching the employees prepare the deposit. Every movement in the room felt exaggerated. Every sound, pen taps, keyboard clicks, the rustle of paper, echoed a little too loudly. Sarah remained behind the counter, her hands steadying only because she forced them to. She glanced up occasionally, watching Seagal from the corner of her eye, but every time she did, she found him utterly calm. Harold hovered behind her, supervising, but in truth, he was doing nothing more than trying not to fall apart. The weight of what had happened, and what could still happen, pressed on him like a physical burden. "All right," Sarah finally said softly, "the check is ready for process." Harold nodded, cleared his throat, and approached Seagal with a careful, almost reverent step. "Sir, everything is in order now. We, deeply appreciate your patience." Seagal didn't respond immediately. He just watched as Sarah placed the taped check into the processing tray. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. "Do you know why I wrote the check in the first place?" Both Harold and Sarah paused. The room stilled again. "I assumed it was a personal transfer," Harold said cautiously. Seagal shook his head. "It was a donation." Sarah blinked. "A donation?" Seagal nodded slowly. "To a foundation that supports families of veterans. 10 million. I've been doing it every year for a long time." A quiet murmur rippled through the bank staff. Suddenly the check wasn't just money, it was purpose. Legacy. Meaning. Sarah felt guilt wash over her all over again, deeper this time. She hadn't just torn a check. She had torn a part of a gesture meant for people who needed it. Seagal continued, his voice calm but heavy with something deeper. "I've seen a lot of people in positions of authority treat others based on assumptions. Looks, clothing, status. It happens everywhere, even in banks." Sarah lowered her eyes. Harold stepped forward, trying to salvage whatever dignity he could. "Mr. Seagal, please understand, Sarah wasn't judging you. She was trying to follow procedure." Seagal turned slowly toward Harold, expression unchanged. "And what were you doing?" Harold froze. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't said with anger. It was simply a question, a knife hidden inside plain language. "What do you mean?" Harold asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "When you came out of your office," Seagal said quietly, "you didn't ask whether she followed the rules. You asked whether she knew who I was." Silence fell over the room like a shroud. Sarah looked at her boss, stunned. He said nothing. Seagal took a small step forward. "You were more worried about the consequences of upsetting someone powerful than you were about the truth." Harold's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "And that," Seagal said, "is how bad decisions get made. No raised voice. No dramatic gesture. Just pure, unfiltered truth." Sarah felt something inside her shift, respect, understanding, a strange mix of relief and shame. Harold, however, looked like a man who had been cracked open. He cleared his throat, forcing composure. "Mr. Seagal, you're absolutely right. I made assumptions. I reacted emotionally. I should have handled the situation better." Seagal didn't reply. He didn't need to. The truth hung in the air where everyone could feel it. After a long pause, Seagal exhaled quietly and looked down at the taped check. "The donation still needs to go through," he said. "I don't back out of commitments." Sarah nodded quickly. Yes, sir. It will be processed within the hour. You'll oversee it yourself, Seagal said gently, almost too gently for how powerful the moment was. Sarah swallowed. Of course. Harold stepped beside her. I'll assist her personally. Seagal gave a small nod, then turned away, walking toward a row of chairs. The quiet authority in his movement made every employee straighten instinctively. He sat down again, relaxed, patient, unbothered. But Harold wasn't done processing what had just happened. He pulled Sarah aside. "Listen," he whispered, voice shaky. "I need to be honest with you." Sarah frowned. "About what?" "When I saw the torn check, my first instinct wasn't to fix the situation. It was to panic about how it might affect me." He rubbed his forehead, embarrassed. "I should have backed you up instead of blaming you." Sarah softened. "We both made mistakes today." He nodded slowly. Then Sarah asked, "Do you think he'll file a complaint?" Harold let out a breath that seemed to deflate his entire body. "I think Seagal isn't the type to make noise about something like this. But he is the type to remember." Sarah glanced toward Seagal again. He sat still, eyes closed, breathing calmly, like none of this had ever bothered him. Yet the weight of his silence said everything. And neither she nor Harold had any idea what he would do next. But they were about to find out. Because the real shock of the day was only just beginning. The bank felt unnaturally quiet now, quieter than it had been at any point earlier. Even the customers who had been standing in line minutes before were pretending to check their phones or paperwork, but their eyes kept drifting toward Steven Seagal. Everyone was waiting. Waiting for him to speak. Waiting for him to react. Waiting for a verdict none of them were brave enough to ask for. Sarah took a slow breath and began finalizing the donation deposit. Her hands were steady now, not because she was calm, but because her focus had sharpened to the point where everything else faded. This was her responsibility, her mistake, her moment to fix what she had broken. Harold stood behind her, supervising closely, but she noticed his fingers fidgeting behind his back, a nervous habit she'd never seen before. The pressure was getting to him just as much as it was to her. "Transaction initiated," Sarah murmured as she entered the routing numbers. "Deposit pending." Harold nodded, forcing a smile. "Good. Perfect. Keep going." But Sarah wasn't looking at him anymore. She noticed something else. Seagal was watching her. Not judging. Not glaring. Just observing. As if he could see the difference between fear and responsibility. She continued typing. Confirming check authenticity, verifying origin, noting repair marks. Harold stiffened. "Don't mention the repair in the permanent log," he whispered urgently. Sarah paused. "I have to. It legally requires. Just mark it as verified with minor alterations. Don't mention the tearing specifically." Sarah looked at him, stunned. "Harold, we can't hide this." Harold's eyes darted nervously toward Seagal. "If the board hears we destroyed a $10 million donation check from him, we'll both be finished." Before Sarah could respond, a voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem?" Steven Seagal. He wasn't standing. He didn't need to. He spoke so calmly that the room froze anyway. Harold stepped forward immediately. "No, sir. No problem at all. Everything is." "Let her answer," Seagal said quietly. Harold fell silent instantly. Sarah swallowed. "The system requires me to note that the check has visible repairs. That's all." Seagal tilted his head slightly. "And your boss told you not to?" Harold's face flushed. "It's just a formality, Mr. Seagal. We want to make sure nothing gets misinterpreted by the audit department. They can be strict about wording." Seagal raised one eyebrow. Just one. Harold stopped talking. Sarah took a breath. "I'm following procedure as written, sir. We're not hiding anything." A slow, almost imperceptible nod from Seagal. "Good." The single word carried more weight than a full lecture. Sarah resumed the deposit. The printer clicked beside her, spitting out forms she would need Seagal to sign. She placed them neatly into a folder and approached him cautiously. "Mr. Seagal, these are authorization forms confirming the deposit. I'll need your signature in 3 places." Seagal accepted the folder, opened it, and signed without hesitation. But when he closed it, he didn't hand it back immediately. Instead, he looked around the room again. "You know," he said, "I've been coming to this bank for years. Always quietly. Always with respect. No one moved. And I've seen good people make mistakes. I don't hold that against anyone." Sarah's shoulders relaxed the tiniest bit. "But," Seagal continued, "I also recognize when a place needs a reminder." Harold's jaw tensed. "Reminder, sir?" Seagal stood up slowly, not dramatically, but purposefully. He held the folder loosely at his side. "A reminder," he said, "that respect isn't earned by money, or power, or reputation." He looked directly at Sarah. "It's earned by how you treat people when you think no one is watching." Sarah's eyes stung with emotion. Harold swallowed hard. "Sir, if there's anything we can do." Seagal turned to him. "You worry too much about what your bosses will think," he said calmly, "and not enough about what your employees deal with." Harold stiffened. Seagal walked closer. "When she tore the check, she followed the rules," he said. "Your first reaction was fear. Fear for yourself, not for her." Harold looked down, unable to respond. The entire bank was listening now. Every customer. Every employee. Everyone. Sarah felt the air shift again, this time not with tension, but with a strange mixture of accountability and clarity. Then Seagal said something that shocked the entire room. "Harold, sit down." No raised voice. No force. Just a simple command. But Harold obeyed immediately. Seagal took the seat next to him. "Tell her the truth," he said. Harold blinked. "The truth?" Seagal nodded. "You were going to fire her, weren't you?" Harold hesitated, then nodded. Sarah felt a jolt go through her chest. Seagal didn't look surprised. "You shouldn't fire good employees for following procedure," he said quietly. "And you shouldn't panic when things get difficult. Leadership is about steadiness. Integrity." Harold nodded again, ashamed. Sarah watched, stunned. She had never seen anyone talk to her boss like this, yet there was no aggression. Just honesty delivered with precision. Seagal stood up again. "I'll be back in 3 days to confirm the deposit," he said. "I expect everything to be handled professionally." He turned toward the exit. "And when I return, I expect her to still be here." Sarah gasped. Harold nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Absolutely." Seagal walked toward the door with the quiet confidence of a man who didn't need threats to be taken seriously. But he paused one last time before leaving. He glanced over his shoulder and said, "Next time someone walks in with something important, look at the person before you look at the paper." Then he stepped out of the bank, and the entire room exhaled at once. But Sarah's story was far from over, because the twist, the real twist, was waiting outside those doors. When Steven Seagal stepped out of the bank, the cold afternoon breeze met him immediately, brushing against his coat as if welcoming him back into the world beyond the glass doors. For a moment, he simply stood there, calm, collected, unreadable. But inside the bank, chaos. The moment the doors closed, the staff erupted in whispers. Some were trying to peek through the windows, others were pacing, and a few looked like they were still struggling to process the last 30 minutes of their lives. Harold had collapsed into a chair, wiping sweat from his forehead like he'd just escaped a courtroom. Sarah didn't say a word. She simply stood behind her counter, one hand gripping the edge, replaying everything Seagal had said. Every sentence felt like it had been etched into her mind. Not as criticism, but as a lesson. A warning. A truth she needed to hear. She let out a slow breath. What a day. But she didn't know. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Outside, Seagal walked toward the parking lot, and that was when he noticed them. Two men standing near a black SUV. Not dressed like fans. Not dressed like ordinary customers. Their posture was too sharp, too aware, too defensive. They straightened when they saw him, exchanging a quick glance that didn't go unnoticed. Seagal kept walking, his steps even and unhurried. When he got closer, one of the men moved forward. "Mr. Seagal, sir. We've been waiting." Seagal stopped, but he didn't speak. The second man stepped closer as well, lowering his voice. "We were notified there was an incident inside." A faint flicker of understanding crossed Seagal's eyes. So the bank wasn't the only place where alarms had been raised. "Everything is handled," Seagal said calmly. The two men exchanged another glance, this one slightly more concerned. "Sir, with respect," the second man said quietly, "when you make donations of that size, we're required to monitor for irregularities. The system flagged the check. Then we received word about a confrontation." Seagal didn't react. He simply crossed his arms. There was no confrontation. The man hesitated. "We heard the manager tore the check." Seagal's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's resolved." The man didn't argue. He simply nodded. Then he pulled out a tablet, tapped a few buttons, and held it out. On the screen was a notification. "Deposit flagged. High-risk alteration. Review required." Seagal took the tablet, studied it, and handed it back. "I'll deal with it," he said. "Yes, sir." Before the men could say more, the bank doors opened behind them. Sarah stepped out. She didn't look at the two men. She didn't look at the SUV. She only looked at Seagal. "Mr. Seagal," she said nervously, "I just wanted to say thank you for today, for not letting me lose my job." He studied her for a moment. "You took responsibility for your actions," Seagal said quietly. "That matters." Sarah smiled, small, uncertain, but genuine. Then one of the men by the SUV stepped forward. "Miss, do you mind if we ask a few questions about what happened?" Immediately, Seagal raised a hand. "No." The man froze. "Sir." Seagal turned slightly, his voice calm but final. "She handled it. It's over." Sarah blinked, surprised. The man nodded respectfully and stepped back. Sarah hesitated. "Mr. Seagal, what you said inside, about respect. I'll remember it." Seagal gave the smallest nod. "Good," he said softly. "Just treat people with fairness. That's all anyone can ask." She nodded again, then turned to head back inside. But before she went through the doors, she stopped, looked over her shoulder, and said, "For what it's worth, I hope your donation helps the people you care about." Seagal's expression softened, just a fraction. "It will." She stepped inside, letting the door close behind her. And then, everything changed. Because the moment she disappeared back into the bank, one of the men from the SUV leaned toward Seagal and whispered, "Sir, the board wants to meet with you in person. Today." Seagal raised an eyebrow. "About what?" The man hesitated. "About the check. And the message we received." "What message?" The man swallowed. "That the bank manager tore it. because she didn't believe it was real. Silence. Seagal's jaw tightened, barely noticeable, but enough that both men saw it. Then, without warning, Seagal took a slow breath and looked at the bank's glass doors. "You know," he said quietly, "people think money is what matters most in a bank." The men waited. "But what really matters," Seagal continued, "is trust." The men nodded. Then he added something that made both men straighten. "And I just saw how fragile that trust is." He turned toward the SUV. "We're going." As the men opened the door for him, Seagal paused and looked directly toward the invisible audience, straight at the viewers. "Before we continue to the final twist, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were Steven Seagal in that moment?" Then Seagal entered the SUV. The door closed. The engine started, and the car pulled away slowly from the bank, leaving behind a shaken staff, a torn check, and a question hanging in the air. What would Steven Seagal do next? The answer was coming, and it would shock everyone. For a moment, the bank lobby returned to normal, at least on the surface. Customers resumed their conversations, the printers hummed, and the security guard shifted back into a relaxed stance. But beneath that calm, something very different was happening. The entire branch felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Steven Seagal stood by the manager's desk, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. Karen, the bank manager, tried to steady herself. She had repaired the situation, apologized, printed a new check, verified the account, and even offered priority processing. Her boss had stepped in, recognized Steven instantly, and treated the whole incident like a near disaster narrowly avoided. But still, there was a lingering question in the air. Something unresolved. Something that needed closure. Steven finally spoke. "You know," he said quietly, "most people wouldn't have had the courage to challenge a check like that." Karen blinked, surprised. "I wasn't trying to challenge you," she said softly. "You followed the rules," Steven replied. "You did your job. That's rare these days." Before Karen could respond, the regional vice president leaned forward. "Mr. Seagal, we deeply apologize. We'll ensure our staff is better equipped." Steven raised a hand, stopping him. "No need. The only thing you need to ensure," he said, looking at Karen, "is that people like her don't get punished for doing the right thing." Karen stared at him, stunned. You're not upset." Steven cracked a tiny smile. "If I got upset every time someone underestimated me, I'd never have time to make movies." He handed Karen a business card. "If you ever want to work in security consulting," he said, "give me a call. I could use someone who isn't afraid to act when something looks wrong." Karen's hands trembled holding the card. Her boss tried to recover, plastering on a nervous smile. Steven nodded once and turned toward the exit. "Good," he said. "Because one day, initiative might save someone." He walked out. Silence returned. But Karen knew she had passed a test, not a disaster. If you believe people should be judged by their actions, not assumptions, type respect in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories like this one.